All right. Let's see how we do here. Okay, good. Hello, everyone. I'm William Taylor, and the purpose of this video is to gauge the relevance of full preterism, or even a certain Christian perspective with regards to things that are happening now. We rarely see a full preterist engage with reality outside of the niche and very isolated scholarly discourse with things regarding the end. Well, how about right now? How about things that happened a couple of days ago in perhaps your home state? We do have some people watching from California on occasion, so this one is in your backyard, Californian. And the story is about a young man who killed himself and perhaps had the intention of killing other people because he detests the idea of life and has an issue with it. And we'll see exactly why that is and what those issues are as we try to understand what was going through this kid's mind and if there's anything that we can offer from the perspective we share on this channel. The Guardian writes, investigators combed through writings of Palm Springs fertility clinic bombing suspect. Suspect who died in explosion left behind nihilistic writings that indicated views against procreation. We can see the damage done here, I believe, to a IVF clinic, a clinic that tries to help people restore their reproductive capacity. Investigators are combing through the writings of the 25-year-old man. Shockingly young, eh? They say that the human brain doesn't finish its maturity, doesn't reach maturity until the age of around 25. Before then, the frontal cortex, the part of the brain that is concerned with foreplanning or looking into the future, right, considering consequences to actions, that part of the brain isn't fully developed until around 25 years of age. And we say, or we reason, this is why children do foolish things. It's why I have a metal plate in my chin, because I thought I was professional wrestler Rob Van Dam and jumped off of a high fence in a freezing Scottish winter to execute a 5-star frog splash, overshot it, my hips hit the mattress and my chin drove into the frozen ground, and so I broke my jaw in 3 places. What's called a guardsman's fracture. The Queen's Guard often wear these big hats. What do you call them? Big bear hats or something. And they sweat and they faint, and it's a common injury sustained by them. Shockingly young. He's believed to be responsible for an explosion that ripped through a fertility clinic in Palm Springs, California over the weekend. The blast on Saturday gutted the American Reproductive Center, a fertility clinic in the desert city, and was powerful enough to leave the windows of nearby buildings along a palm tree-lined street shattered. None of the facility's embryos were damaged. Akhil Davies, the assistant director in charge of the FBI's Los Angeles field office, called it possibly the largest bombing scene that we've had in Southern California. This was a targeted attack against the IVF facility, Davies said Sunday. Make no mistake, we are treating this, as I said yesterday, as an international act of terrorism. Sorry, an intentional. The suspect was a US citizen, so it's not international. The FBI has identified Edward Bartkus of nearby 29 Palms as a suspect in the attack. Bartkus died in the explosion. They haven't said if he intentionally killed himself in the attack or why he chose that specific facility. Authorities are working to learn more about his motives, but have said Bartkus left behind nihilistic writings that indicate views against procreation, known as anti-natalism. What do we know about anti-natalism? We'll get into that in this video. In his writings, he communicated nihilistic ideations that were still being examined to determine his state of mind. A US attorney and top federal prosecutor in that area. Now, I don't believe he was a nihilist in the purest sense. We'll get into that. In general, nihilism suggests that life is meaningless. I don't think that's the issue here. I don't think he thought that necessarily. I think he thought other things. I think he was despairing. He appeared to hold anti-natalist views, which include a belief that it is morally wrong for people to bring children into the world. All right. So that's the basic story. He's an anti-natalist. He believes it's wrong to bring people into the world. So I scoured the internet looking for a breakdown of his manifesto, of his ideology, and I've thrown together a document here. Now this camera is supposed to be functioning, so let me just real quick jump in here. How do I fix this? No, that didn't do it. I'm just very still, like I'm very stoic in this video. Let's just remove it. Now there's no camera, and we'll let it back in just now. One of these days I'm not going to have technical difficulties, but then you won't be able to find my channel. Pap. So I've got a PowerPoint presentation here to break through this, break it down, and discuss it in a bit more detail. Move to the top. Here we go. So Guy Bartkus and the philosophy of despair. And I think that's crucial because as we examine his writings, I think the despair will become very apparent. So the first slide is a look at his philosophy of anti-natalism. Can I increase the size of this a bit? Yeah, that'll do. Okay. So antinatalism or pro-mortalism. Bartkus expressed anger at having been born without his consent. These were his words. Very interesting. How can you be angry at something like that? And he explicitly targeted an IVF clinic, which is a symbol of deliberate procreation. And it's a classic antinatalist piece of reasoning, the belief that bringing life into existence is morally wrong due to the suffering inherent in life. So that's interesting, isn't it? It touches on the problem of evil, which sort of casts light on that too, the problem of suffering. Pro-mortalism takes this further. Not only is birth bad, but death is considered preferable, even merciful, because it ends suffering. Bartkus's bombing was framed as a protest against the deliberate creation of life, indicating a belief that non-existence is better than existence. Isn't that interesting? We'll break that down, but it's just interesting that he was so full of anguish, and you wonder about the perspective this young man had and the experiences that he had that led him to make these horrible choices. So then we have negative utilitarianism. So negative utilitarianism prioritizes the reduction of suffering over the promotion of happiness. So it seems to be something like life is suffering. Creating more life equals creating more suffering. Therefore, the moral thing to do is to prevent or end life. And it's obviously not what classical utilitarianism is all about, because that's all about the greatest happiness that can be brought about, hedonic calculus. This is a twisted version of that, where you would frame it more as negative utilitarianism, the cessation of sentient existence being the highest moral good, because it sort of extinguishes suffering entirely. It kind of reminds you of like Thanos or something like that. Even this is a bit darker, even than the machinations of Thanos. And then we have pure nihilism. And the idea here is that I don't think it doesn't seem to be. Nihilistic despair might have been a part of what motivated him. The idea that nothing matters, the idea that life is a joke, is the language that the young man used. But he didn't act like a traditional nihilist. That's someone who would reject all moral claims, including the moral justification for bombing. Instead, he acted with moral conviction, believing he was doing something right and necessary. So those are not traditionally the motivations of a true nihilist. This seems more like an ideological action, garnished with this utilitarian anti-natalism. So the big takeaways are his beliefs that suffering is a dominant feature of existence, that consent is morally essential to be born, and that life as a net negative is worth preventing or entirely extinguishing. So this is someone you wouldn't want to hire as a babysitter. This is someone you would be very suspect of. And tragically, it resulted in the end of the young man's life. Or did it? Now, he died in the explosion, but I mean, spiritually, we might wonder at his fate. So, antinatalism and pro-mortalism believe being born without consent is immoral. Death is preferable to life as it ends suffering. It prioritizes reducing suffering over increased happiness. And then we see that, it wasn't a pure nihilism, but it certainly set the tone. So if we look at his core values, there's a lot to be made here. Consent and autonomy seem to be one of his main values. He repeatedly expressed outrage that no one asked for his consent to be born. To him, the act of birth is a violation of bodily and existential autonomy. So we could say that his value there is that people should not be forced into existence without consent. Okay, so what's a full preterist response to that core value? Well, you might say that the beliefs of this young man are tragically inverted, and it's a tragically inverted form of Christian ideology, or the Christian idea of voluntary union with God. The gospel is not about coercion, but about invitation. Life is not forced enslavement, but the opening of a door. Your response can affirm that God respects autonomy to such a degree that he fulfilled his promises without forcing that belief. And now now he offers eternal life, not as a threat or burden, but as present spiritual participation. So the idea that consent should be necessary and that it violates bodily and existential autonomy, well, it's a philosophical absurdity to suggest that you need permission to exist, because the precondition to meditate on those ideas would be that you come into existence, right? You cannot ask if someone wants to be brought into existence. That is a torturous loop. It doesn't make any sense. So clearly there's something about disorientation going on here. You can see my top today covered in compasses and whatnot, right? It's all about orientation and direction. This kid, he didn't have that. Something was broken in his mind. And we'll develop that idea a little further as we go on. Opposition to suffering. He believes existence is marked by suffering and that it's unethical to impose that suffering on others through procreation, hence his hatred of IVF clinics. So his core value here would be that suffering is the worst thing. It must be prevented, even if that means preventing life. Okay. So a full preterist response to that might be that suffering is real, but not ultimate. The kingdom is come, and with it the defeat of death and law-based condemnation. You could explain that human suffering is part of a decaying shadow age now eclipsed by spiritual resurrection, and that full preterism doesn't deny pain, it reinterprets it through Christ's triumph, not deferring meaning to some far-off hope. Yeah. The idea that suffering is the worst thing is a complete error in judgment. I don't think suffering is the worst thing. The point has been made on this topic that sometimes people enjoy suffering, right? We might call them sadists, okay? I wouldn't say that the Cenobites are to be aspired to. However, there's also the idea of engaging with tension, with grit, with the corrosive elements of this earth to better refine yourself. You know, Paul spoke about how some exercise is good for the body. Well, the point's made that exercise is a form of suffering, and you go through that to increase your strength and stamina. And stamina, yes. Similarly, studying for hours, you know, is an arduous process, but the labor produces fruit. Ploughing a field, planting seeds, tending to the crops, chasing away pests, that is a labor, but it produces a crop. You yield something good from it. And indeed, the only way to identify suffering is to contrast it with pleasure, because any singular experience protracted indefinitely isn't necessarily a thing. It's just thing, right? There's nothing to delineate it from anything else. It's the point of, if we were born into bliss, we wouldn't know that we existed in bliss, right? There would be nothing, there would be no, like, if you have an orgasm, let's say, you can register how that feels, right? Because it's like, right, this is your baseline, and then whoop, you go up here. Or if you use a drug, sometimes, I've never taken recreational drugs, but if you do, I watched a Kirkus, I don't know, it's like a German educational channel on YouTube, and they were talking about heroin. If you take that, that hits up all your, neurotransmitters, and it totally exhausts your capacity to feel joy afterwards. But you can hit that serotonin and take it to the oof, right? What you notice there is a change in your way of being, how you feel in yourself, a chemical imbalance. But if you just lived at the peak, then that wouldn't be an orgasm, that wouldn't be a heroin high. If you existed in that state and protracted it indefinitely, that would just be a static experience without texture, without reference to anything else. So you wouldn't really know that you were enjoying yourself, because in order to enjoy yourself, you need to process a change of state. So the point I'm making is that the suffering is a consequence of the positivity and a requirement. They're they're referential and determined by one another in a way. There's a beautiful, um, not necessarily symbiotic, but some kind of uh, dueling nature between those two things. That's this beautiful dance, and we got to dance that dance, you know. So yeah, opposition to suffering. Third point here is moral absolutism. So Burkus wasn't amoral, he was fiercely moralistic. He believed that bringing people into this world was a moral wrong, and he saw his attack as a moral stand. So the core value here is there are things so wrong they must be stopped, no matter the cost. And of course, the grandest cost of all was the young man's life. So a full preterist response might be affirming his moral sensitivity, but to reorientate it, Burkus was trying to destroy the wrong kingdom. Full preterism reveals that the corrupt order was already judged. Jerusalem's fall was the end of the old world. Now, the battle is not to destroy, but to build justice, compassion, and a presence in the already but unseen kingdom of God. I don't like these prefabbed uh, responses so much. They don't sound very heartfelt. But there's a little something in there. So a response to the core value of there are things so wrong they must be stopped, no matter the cost. What the hell's that? Gabriel has sounded his trumpet. No, I don't know what that was. It sounded like a goose in a loudspeaker. Yeah. There is something to be said for moral clarity, but this kid didn't have moral clarity. He had the idea of taking action, which is something a lot of young men want to do. We want to be called to action. See how I included myself in the category of young man? I still am technically, you know. There is a desire, not just for young men, for old guys too, right? For the rugged warriors, right? For the fathers and grandfathers. There's a call that we have to adventure, to do, to participate. Now, what this kid did was he gave himself a purpose ultimately. He gave himself a purpose and he moved in the direction of that purpose. His very expression is so contradictory, right? Because he's doing the thing that he claims to hate. All he's did is semantically slide around the words, but he's still participating in something that's full of meaning and full of participation. And strangely enough, he even contributed to the suffering that he, or would have potentially even worse, contributed to the suffering had he destroyed the embryos or killed another human being. So his response was completely inappropriate. Very strong language, you know, to call a suicide bombing completely inappropriate. Hatred of hypocrisy. So Burkus had the view that he was disgusted by what he saw as shallow reasons for having children, people chasing idealized normalcy while ignoring the suffering of the world. So the core value would be people are blind to real pain, society is shallow and dishonest. Here we go. There is a strange madness at play. I think there's a strange madness in Burkiss's view because he does mourn his own existence. But when he does that, like I said before, he affirms the very thing that he claims to reject. That he's here conscious, able to speak, think, to resist. So there's a strange paradox at play. So he has a lament. I'll jump over here. Yeah, probably should have went through these, but you could see I was talking them out anyway. So he laments his existence, but to lament existence is to affirm it, right? I didn't consent to be born presupposes a life that exists to judge existence. But the self couldn't exist without birth. You can't opt out of being without first being. And that turns into a self-consuming loop. Yeah, we get the idea there. Absurdism versus resurrection. So Camus had this idea, this paradox, the clash between our longing for meaning and the silence of the universe. Burkiss wasn't just angry, he was trapped in that absurdity and chose annihilation as his answer. But here's where full preterism diverges. The universe is not silent. The universe has spoken, it has judgment, and it has judged, and has a restorative quality to it. And that restoration isn't something that's distant and inaccessible. It's something that's here. It's something that happened in history, is unfurling into the present and in Christ. And when we say in Christ, we're talking about that participation in the Spirit. So the absurdist position is the one that says there is no meaning, so embrace the void, right? That's not our cup of tea. Full preterism would offer an alternative. The veil is torn, the silence is broken, the age of shadow is over, the kingdom has come, you are not a cosmic mistake. And I do believe that the universe does speak to us. It speaks to us through the voices of those we are willing to listen to. Even if you're the most staunch materialist, this is what the universe has created. Sentient, artistic, creative, imaginative beings, yes, capable of terrible things, but also capable of such beautiful things too. And you need to consider your biases. In psychology, there's something called a negative attention bias. People with a family history of depression or who have suffered depression in the past, when tested, will identify the unhappy faces in a crowd before acknowledging neutral and happy faces. So there's an attention bias that is orientated negatively, and they are drawn to the negative. What we must do is train ourselves to do otherwise. And you can. It is completely doable. At the start, I talked about the development of the brain. Well, the brain is entirely plastic. We mentioned the knowledge where London cab drivers were scanned before and after, learning all the routes around the city of London. Before and after, the MRI scans showed an increase in size of the hippocampus of the brain, the part of the brain which is involved in mapping out and visualizing and retaining this particular spatial type of knowledge. It had grown in volume, right? So the brain has this incredible plasticity to it. It uses itself efficiently and it reconfigures itself to your reality. or indeed your perceived reality. So, what does that tell us about the power of perception and the power of belief and the power of perhaps living in a more enlightened, victorious, jubilant, confident, just having a more fulfilled way of being? That is what the full preterist perspective is offering, and it's an offer worth accepting. So, existence as a gift. You can't consent before existing. To protest birth affirms autonomy. Life is not the theft of consent, but its beginning. I like that idea. To protest being born is to affirm the value of autonomy. So therein is the absurdity again. To protest being born is to affirm the value of autonomy, not to deny it. Autonomy requires a self. Therefore, the protest is actually an implicit acknowledgement of sacred agency. The deeper truth that Bartkus never glimpsed is that agency doesn't precede life, it emerges from it. So, what Bartkus should have done is grown into those qualities that he sought or saw as desirous. But there was a colossal amount of ignorance and hubris at play in the young man. He couldn't conceive of a version of himself 40 years in the future. He couldn't envision a version of himself that had lived experience and had reflected in, what life had to offer and come to a different conclusion. I mean, people often say, what is a 25-year-old? What's a 25-year-old? 10 years ago, they were 15, right? They hadn't done anything. They'd barely finished high school. Well, some of them don't finish high school at 15 in certain countries. He hadn't lived a day of his life yet, but he had already come to this firm conclusion. That's hubris. That's a lack of orientation and guidance. Again, it's not to say that young people cannot have good ideas. The United States of America was conceived of by people in their late 20s and early 30s, right? You think of these old powdered white, or just people with, this old-timey clothes on, you think they were ancient. They weren't. They were all young people. Revolutions have been fought throughout history by people in their 20s. But it's not to say that people in their 20s cannot have good ideas, or that you need to be over 25 and have this mature brain to conceive of a wonderful idea. That's not the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is speaking to despair. It's showing that there's other perspectives. And I'm not necessarily saying, you have to use my tools to see sense. I'm not necessarily saying that. Your toolbox could have a different label on the front of it. I think what I'm saying is the approach I'm taking is it's available to you, right? It's like saying to someone to forgive. Forgiveness is available to you. You just have to access it. So, yeah, I think that's basically it. Yeah, that's that slide. It's not finished, or rather it is finished, but it's not futile. Christ's work is something that we get to participate in and enjoy the fruits of. Yeah, okay. So I can see my camera's a little janky. I don't know why. I'm going to try and resolve these technical difficulties soon, but I'm going to leave this one here. It's quite a somber topic, but I think it's important to speak meaning into society as best as we can. Gosh, that camera is so distracting. Right, I might try another attempt at a video tonight and resolve this issue, but I'm going to stop this one here. So thanks for watching, guys. Let me see how this is going. Yeah, it's a little bit crazy. Shake stars from the sky. It was a pleasure. Yeah. River Eagle, I can see that that issue has been playing up. And Jackie, yeah. Some people just have that lack of control with their emotions. So, yeah, that's frustrating, isn't it, with the camera? See if I remove the camera, and then I could bring it back, perhaps. This is me just working out a technical glitch. And I can just expand that kind of thing. Yeah, whatever. No, it's still not working. Right, all right, you know what? I'm going to take a bit of time and try and work out this technology a bit better. But thanks for watching, guys, and